Goedenavond iedereen, met Alessandra van de Wereld Morgen. We zitten vandaag hier met een webinar met Vijay Prashad over Palestina en de wereld die kantelt. Vijay Prashad, historicus, journalist en schrijver. Vijay, welcome this evening. Thank you very much for being here with us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks a lot.
And we'll be this evening talking about two topics, the tilting North and South relations, as well as the militarization and war fever that's happening in the West. Afterwards as well, some questions on what can we do about it. And I would like to immediately jump to the first question. When you're talking about tilting North and South relations, we can see what's going on now in Gaza, with genocide in Gaza, actually. There's a major split in the world about that. So almost all Western countries do not recognize Palestine as a state, while the majority of the countries in the South do. Can you explain that split for us?
Well, the first thing is that it's important to register that large majorities of the people in both the global North and in the global South stand with Palestine. Even in Europe and in North America, large majorities of people, for instance, want a ceasefire. Even in the United States, not only the closest ally of the Israeli government, but an enabler of that government, even in the United States, over 65% of the population surveyed say they want a ceasefire. So it's important for us to recognize that even in the North, very large numbers of people are really exasperated, dissatisfied, disheartened by what is going on. Now, the question you asked is a very important question, and it will take a minute to sort out. First, it's important to say that the countries of the global South, whether it be Mexico, South Africa, even India, China and so on, stand with the Palestinian people on the grounds that these countries have experienced some kind of colonization. And the common experience of colonization has made them, since the 1940s, stand with the Palestinians for decolonization. So in the non-aligned movement, which is one of the world's largest non-UN bodies, in the non-aligned movement, it has been a regular feature for the non-aligned movement and the countries that belong to it to call for the decolonization of Palestine. It's been a regular feature in the various commissions of the UN for the global South to lift up the word of Palestine. I mean, it's not just the quote-unquote Muslim majority countries. This is important. Indeed, in the Muslim majority countries, Indonesia, Turkey, the Arab world and so on, there's a special feeling for the Palestinians, perhaps based on a kind of religious affinity. But that's not really the motivating factor. It's the question of decolonization that motivates people. In the global North, led by the United States, there is a very strange attitude towards Israel, and it's differential. In Europe itself, the attitude towards Israel is born out of deep guilt over the Holocaust of the Jews between 1941 or 1940 and 1945, when 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. I mean, the fact of the matter is, Europe has multiple centuries of a history of anti-Semitism, which the European countries haven't really dealt with. Anti-Semitism wasn't created by the Arabs, wasn't created in India or in Chile. Anti-Semitism is a product of Europe's history. And Europe, not having dealt with anti-Semitism, has transferred, in a way, its own guilt about anti-Semitism onto the Palestinians and blames the Palestinians, bizarrely, for anti-Semitism. This is a very curious reaction. Europe needs to deal with its own history of anti-Semitism, come to terms with it, and not transfer that onto the Palestinians. In the United States, it's slightly different. In the United States, it's a more practical and pragmatic approach, and a kind of crazy approach. The practical and pragmatic is the view that Israel is a kind of aircraft carrier for the United States. It provides a sort of front for US power in the Arab world to control the oil nations and so on. That's the practical, pragmatic side. Then there's a crazy side. there's an entire theory of Christian Zionism that functions in the evangelical community that suggests that when the Jews destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque, build the temple, the second temple, then Christ the Redeemer is going to come back to earth and kill all non-Christians, including the Jews. I mean, this is the reason for kind of evangelical support of Israel, which has a role in the US Congress. And by the way, is growing in countries like Brazil and in some countries in Africa, where this evangelical presence is what motivates Bolsonaro of Brazil and Javier Milei of Argentina to be effectively Christian Zionists. So that exists in the global south as well, but still it's under check by this greater decolonization feeling. So as I said, it takes a little time to explain this, but in the north, there are very bizarre ways in which fealty to Israel is very hard to knock.
That's definitely very noticeable. But I have to then say, because that from the genocide in Gaza, it was one part, but we also have the war of Ukraine, Russia. And we see there as well quite a division where the West really tried to put some heavy economic sanctions to Russia. And we have quite some countries that did not go along with it. It was a clear failure there. So do you think that means that the West is losing some grip to the South, or?
Well, let's be quite clear about one thing, is that on many foreign policy issues, there's a great divergence between the North and the South. I mean, the North and the South are not fixed entities. There's all kinds of movements, and, there are countries in the so-called global South that are very much pro-Western and so on. These are not fixed names, but still, there's a kind of dividing line. And Ukraine is a good place to test that, because most of the countries of the South simply said that we don't accept your storyline about Ukraine. We don't think Russia is the aggressor here. Yes, Russia broke international law by sending its tanks across the international border. But on the other hand, Russia is not seeking to subordinate Ukraine. It merely wants to take care of Russian nationals in Donetsk and Lugansk and in the Donbass region and so on. These are the kind of arguments that they're not seen as Putin talking points, in the global South. These are taken seriously, that Russia's security needs have not been fulfilled, that the United States has walked out of a number of different treaties, including the anti-ballistic missile treaty. It's walked out of the short-range nuclear missile treaty. And there's a fear in Moscow that the United States wanted to put short-range nuclear missiles in Ukraine. This is something that the global South understands, this kind of threat. Why? Because so many of those countries have faced regime change, have faced war from the North, have faced sanctions and so on. They understand the storyline. But I want to say one thing about this. There were actually differences of opinion even a decade ago, but countries in the South didn't articulate them. Namibia, for instance, which has been forthright in criticizing Germany on the question of genocide. Namibia, whose prime minister in Munich was challenged about her government's refusal to condemn Russia. And she said, during our fight against apartheid, the Russians helped us, then the Soviet Union helped us, and so on. Well, Namibia has held these views for many years. Why haven't they articulated them? Because until recently, Namibia was forced to go to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to clear debts and so on, and therefore didn't want to antagonize the US Treasury Department or antagonize Washington. Now, Namibia can go to the People's Bank of China. It can go to the New Development Bank. It can go to private banks in Indonesia. It can go to Brazilian banks and so on. There's a lot of options. So they don't feel constrained by the kind of economics of debt. The economics of debt, in a sense, curtailed free speech in the global South. And now that there's a kind of opening with China in the lead of this economically, countries are freer to say, we don't agree with you.
Then that brings me to my next question, because you see a lot of these changes, as we just mentioned, But then that means, just like you said, I gave a clear example. You can see the West losing this credibility with the South, but not only credibility, but also the financial power, you could say a bit. So is that one of the ways in which you can notice that the loss of grip from the North?
Precisely, that's one of the ways. I mean, it is exactly the case that if you have a country that, for instance, is in a position to say, hey, listen, I'm able to, say, reconcile my debt somewhere else, I don't really need you, then your muscle deteriorates. You're unable to force me to take a certain position. Gone are the days, in a very real way, gone are the days when, when the United States would tell a country, you better do this, and you had to do this. Gone are those days. Now governments can turn to the US to some extent. Let's not exaggerate this either. To some extent, governments can say to the US, we're not scared of you. I mean, I must say, the election result from South Africa of a weakened ANC, African National Congress, and the fact that the African National Congress has gone into an alliance with the US leaning Democratic Alliance is going to constrain South Africa's ability to be so outspoken on the genocide in Gaza. This is not necessarily going to be easy for the government. We don't even know really who's going to be running the foreign ministry in South Africa. Naledi Pandor herself produced the kind of independent foreign policy for the office. Don't know what's going to happen there. So this squeezing and constraining continues one way or the other. But there's also now a great deal of freedom because there is no single master, as Putin put it at the 2007 Munich Security Conference. The world is much more complicated than it was 20 years ago.
Because then it's quite clear then from the way you're saying that there is clearly a shift in the North-South relations, right? We cannot deny that anymore.
No, I mean, this is undeniable. It's undeniable that we in our institute call it a new mood. We say there's a new mood in the South. And the reason we use the term mood is I'm not keen right now, quite frankly, to exaggerate the situation. We shouldn't be talking about the creation of a multipolar world. We are nowhere near that right now. What we are is we're sort of exiting the era when the United States thought that it was the only pole. Remember, the United States thought it was never the only pole. There was never anything called unipolarity. It was an era where the US wanted to establish itself as the only pole. Many people held out. That's why the United States called them rogue states. Who held out? Cuba, North Korea, Iran, Syria, all the countries the US wanted to overthrow the governments. They were not willing to accept the dispensation that the US was providing. The US tried to be the only country, couldn't do it because, little asterisks and obliques in their little village at the edge of Gaul were resisting. The Cuban Revolution, for instance, is a classic asterisks and obliques village refusing to give in to the pressures of the Roman Empire. With the magic potion of Marxism, they were holding out. Now we are in a situation where the US is having an even harder time. More and more people are rebelling. More and more people are basically turning up and saying, we don't accept your diktat. But we are not at a multipolar place. In other words, we were never in a unipolar era, and we are not in a multipolar era. Contradictions are much more fluid than these terms imply. But we've definitely entered a period where the United States is weaker than it had been, but not weakened entirely.
Exactly then what I was thinking, because you were quite clear on that, and you're very right from my opinion as well, that they are not completely weak yet, because we see in a lot of their policies, actually just West imperialist policies, they are horrific. They have terrible effects in a lot of countries, but we can see time and time again that they just get away with it. So often enough, no consequences for them. Can you kind of talk a bit about that? Do you think that they are viewed differently in the South, or why is it as well that they can so easily get away with it?
Get away with it. I mean, you know what's interesting? No, no, it's a perfectly good formulation on your part. I very much like that formulation. Get away with it. Get away with it because they have. I mean, recently at a press conference, James Kirby, who's the spokesperson for the US National Security Agency, was, talking about the nature of the Israeli bombing, the genocidal nature, wiping out entire neighborhoods using 2,000-pound bombs on, civilian homes and so on. And Kirby said, in the middle of this defense of the Israelis, Kirby said, I don't see what the problem is because we, the United States, did the same thing in Iraq. Okay, getting away with it. No International Court of Justice sanction, no International Criminal Court investigation of a real kind, no International Criminal Court warrants, nothing. Tony Blair of the United Kingdom, George W. Bush of the United States, where are they except free men who think they did a good thing in the world? They conducted an illegal war. Over 1 million people had died. I'm using that example just to amplify your phrase, get away with it, because they do get away with it. They committed a crime. It's an illegal war. Kofi Annan, the head of the United Nations, said in 2004, the US attack on Iraq was illegal. If it was illegal, it's against the law. If it's against the law, there should be consequences. But to use your phrase, they got away with it. I'm using an extreme example, the war on Iraq. There are less extreme examples. Suffocating countries to death, Zimbabwe, what the British and the United States did. Why? Because the government of Robert Mugabe said all the property is going to be taken by the state and distributed to black farmers. Why should white farmers control large tracts of property? This was seen as outlandish. In South Africa, in this election, the party of Jacob Zuma, the MK, and the party of Julius Malema, the economic freedom fighters, both said we should confiscate land without compensation because it was illegally taken in the first place. And the whole of the financial sector in South Africa ganged up and said the ANC cannot ally with those two parties. There'll be no consequences. They will continue austerity policies against the people and so on. This is the way that they think it should work forever. Now, when they get challenged, as they are getting challenged by many of the rising southern countries, particularly on the African continent, when they get challenged, their response is to fight off the challenger, not commercially. Like, why don't US multinationals simply try to outwit the Chinese in an intercapitalist rivalry on the African? No, because they can't. They don't have the ability. Chinese capital is far better equipped to build infrastructure on the African continent. So then the United States starts the new Cold War against China, accusing China of colonialism in Africa, never actually acknowledging the colonialism of Europe in Africa, accusing China of colonialism, and then saying when China builds a bridge in Africa, that bridge is not built for humanitarian purposes. But when the United States blows up a bridge in Libya, they blow up the bridge for humanitarian purposes. Oh my God. It's an upside down. Even Alice in Wonderland is confused.
Well, that does also bring me to think a bit about the next topic that we want to go into, militarization, because, you quite nicely bringing the topics indeed about what US has done indeed in the bombing. It is quite clear that has been this increase in the war fever and militarization, as I said, from Europe, US, just the West. Some of it has been also the war between Russia and Ukraine, but also quite a bit directed at China. Do you think it is a coincidence that all of that is happening at the same time that we have the tilting between North and South? Or you think there's no coincidence at all and there's something behind it?
It's interesting. A few years ago, I was invited to give some testimony in the Belgian parliament. around the question of using Belgian Navy as part of a NATO mission to conduct freedom of navigation exercises in the Arctic Circle, basically to provoke the Russians who claim through where the ice cap is their territorial waters. And the testimony I gave to the Belgian parliament was pretty straightforward. Number one, does Belgium really want to get involved in a struggle motivated by US interests, but for which Belgium has no interest? Like, for instance, and this was before the war started with Russia, do you want to actually cut off your energy supplies from Russia? Because if you cut off your energy supplies from Russia, you will import fuel inflation. You're going to have to import energy from the United States. So why would you provoke a major energy supplier? Is there really a need to conduct a freedom of navigation exercise in the Arctic Circle? Now, interesting, freedom of navigation exercise. This is a concept that comes from the 1982 UN Convention on the Laws of the Sea. Okay, it's a pretty good convention. Part of the convention says that in international waters, no government should try to exercise a gate. You can't close down the Straits of Gibraltar as long as there's an international channel. Spain can only claim up to its territorial limit. Morocco claims its territorial limit. But then if there's a gap, then you should allow shipping. You can't close it. The Dardanelles Straits and so on. You can't close it. And there are some areas where even even national waters should be allowed for international shipping. For instance, the Bosphorus River in Turkey, from the Crimea, that's how Russian ships come out, is through the Bosphorus, the only exit for them, and things like that. Okay, it's a pretty good law. United States government has never ratified that law. So the US government actually doesn't participate in that treaty. And many NATO countries haven't ratified that law. And yet the United States, which runs NATO may be headquartered in Brussels, but Belgium doesn't run NATO, okay? NATO is a US project inside Europe. United States has not ratified the Convention on the Laws of the Sea in 1982. And yet it uses it as a hammer to hammer the Russians and hammer the Chinese. You're going to have ships going through the Arctic, ships in the South China Sea, coming close to and into the territorial waters to provoke a response. This is what the European ships joining the United States are doing in the South China Sea. This is precisely what NATO wanted Belgium to do in the Arctic Circle. Terrible, terrible way to build confidence in the world. Okay? It's a terrible way because it's effectively provoking other countries. Just imagine for a minute, if Chinese warships came off the coastline of Belgium to conduct freedom of navigation in the North Sea, how would you like it then? If Russian warships started to come, how would you like it then? If Russian warships came next to New York Harbor, in the international waters, just patrolled up and down, how would the United States like that? They wouldn't like it at all. In fact, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Russian missiles were going to be placed in Cuba, the United States went nuts. Meanwhile, US and NATO missiles were in Turkey, pointing directly at the USSR. What's good for the goose should be good for the gander. There is a militarization build up against Russia and China. They are using Ukraine on one side as a provocation, and the Russians walked into that. They invaded Ukraine. And they're trying to use Taiwan at the other end as a kind of trap, to spring a trap to get the Chinese to respond. The Chinese are being extremely patient, circumspect, not allowing the trap to close. I think they're pretty impressive in how they constantly talk about development and peace, not war. China is responsible for 10% of the world's military budget, 10% annually. The United States and its NATO allies are responsible for 75% of the world military budget. Now you tell me who's a threat. Russia is responsible for 3% of the world military budget. Tell me who's a threat. Add China and Russia together, it's 13%. NATO is 75%. And by the way, NATO is a military treaty. Russia and China do not have a military treaty. They are strategic partners. Russia goes to war, China doesn't have to declare war on behalf of Russia. There's no military treaty. But NATO is a military treaty. That's why adding up the sum total of NATO countries' military spending makes sense. Because if you go to war against the United States, you're going to war against all the NATO countries. That's 75% of world military spending on your head. Right now in Europe, you're having a debate about 2% military spending. This is a misleading debate. This is about 2% of GDP in a country. But global military spending, Europe, United States, South Korea, Japan, 75% of world military spending. What do you need all these weapons for?
But then that actually makes me think, because as you were saying, here in Europe, the amount of money is being put into this is just crazy. But there have been talks about as well reintroducing the compulsory military service. Do you think we should be worrying about that? Because I in Brazil, we have that actually still, I believe. And it's something that I'm terrified for in the future, to have to see young people be forced to go to war. So what do you think about it?
I mean, it's interesting, okay? All over the world, not just in Europe, all over the world, the employment situation is abysmal. You know, in India, a study recently came out, showed 45% is the rate of youth unemployment, very high. You know, all over the world, the youth unemployment situation is terrible. So what do you do when young people are unemployed? Why not think about interesting policies for young people? You know, I would say, just as an example, if you're a small country, you know, Belgium is a small country, you say that we're going to start a program of, like, for instance, parks maintenance. You know, we're going to give the municipalities X amount of money to hire people between the age of 17 and 27 to clean up, maintain, and create good structures, parks for animals, for children, for elders to walk in, maybe an exercise area, whatever. And we want a whole bunch of young people hired. It'll take care of youth unemployment, and we'll get really nice parks at the end of it in all our neighborhoods, okay? Inside the poorest neighborhood in Brussels, we're going to build a high-quality place for kids. Or we're going to have a new program called music education, where we're going to hire a bunch of young people who know how to play the guitar, the drums, the this, the that, the piano, and they're going to go to community centers and teach younger people how to play musical instruments. You know, we're going to hire people, put our money into that to create a friendlier, happier society with basic skills, painting, how to be a clown, and so on. Let's hire young people in large numbers to enrich society. No, let's not do that. Instead, let's hire all the unemployed young people and put them through military training. For what? For what? Do you think actually Belgium is going to go to war with Russia? Are you mad? Are you crazy? The Russians are not saying that we want to send our tanks to Brussels and to Paris and to Madrid. They're not even sending their tanks to Kiev. They are trying to hold the Donbass region and the Crimea. And we can discuss why they are doing that, but they certainly don't have the intent to go and colonize the whole continent. They're not interested in that. They're not interested in trying to occupy and manage the Belgian population. Okay, the Nazis couldn't do it. Why would the Russians succeed today? So why not solve the youth unemployment problem socially, you know, with social programs to help society? Why do you have to solve the youth unemployment problem militarily? Compulsory military service is ridiculous. You know, it shows the failure of imagination. You know, you have declining public infrastructure in Western countries. Every time I travel to Western countries, I'm always struck by how the parks look dated and old, how community centers are vanishing, how local health clinics don't exist, and so on. Hire young people to build all that. Hire young people to go out and paint murals to make the walls of cities look pretty and fun and so on, and not dreary and dead. That's a social solution to the youth unemployment crisis. But these brain dead politicians, militarized politicians who are in the pocket of military, arms companies and so on, they can only think about a military solution to a basic problem of youth unemployment.
I was going to say, because it's clearly not trying to solve the youth unemployment. They just want to actually indeed invest more in weapons, because quite clear now they're doing everything they can to send more and more weapons to Ukraine. We see that here, we see in the neighboring countries, we see that literally everywhere. But the thing is, it's not helping, clearly. What do you think that actually we here in the West, what should be really our take in this conflict?
I mean, look, people are doing what they can do. There are two ways to fight to end this conflict. One is to fight to improve the situation in your own countries. One of the things I'm often puzzled by is, why is it that young students in Western countries aren't fighting against the rise of the costs of education? Why has this not provoked massive student unrest across the Western countries? I know there are pockets of resistance. This university has a strike, that student group puts out a statement, but where is the all Europe united student position? Why hasn't there been a conference of students demanding that rather than spend money on weapons, they spend money on the children of the country? I mean, that's one anti-war politics. You don't have to walk with a banner that says stop the war. You can walk with a banner that says don't make me carry this debt for the rest of my life. Because what you're saying is that governments have choices. They can either choose to solve the student debt crisis, or they can choose to subsidize arms dealers to make weapons that don't help anybody. That's a choice. That's called politics. Right now, most governments, whether right-wing governments or liberal governments, are choosing to spend money to subsidize arms dealers. That's what they're doing. They're not helping students in debt. So if students organize in a society on a continent-wide basis particularly and say, we want the debt crisis a priority, must be ahead of the arms dealer subsidy, that's going to help to demilitarize societies. If you have entire communities stand up and say, we want the care economy rebuilt, what's happened is austerity is sexist. Austerity has come to rely on patriarchy for the care of children, for the care of elders, for the care of the household, and so on. Austerity is a patriarchal policy. What we want is, we want a society that socializes childcare, that socializes elder care, that takes care of many aspects of the care society. We don't want also to import workers from, say, Asia for very low levels of money, emancipate women in European society. That's not emancipation. That's merely bringing in somebody to do your work for you. Socialize those aspects of society. Austerity is patriarchal. Fight that. All of these struggles, these things that look like parochial struggles, are also actually anti-war struggles. It's related. The more you move the budget to solve people's actual problems, the less there will be for the warmongers. And that's what we have to do. We build a direct anti-war peace movement, fine, but also directly address the real problems in society. You can't build a peace movement that doesn't address the real problems in society, because then a peace movement sounds abstract. People need to get motivated onto the streets by practical things that they are also experiencing. And as I gave you two examples, student example and the austerity example of care economy, these two, if you build movements around them, you are fighting for a peace economy. You are fighting for a peace agenda.
So I almost got an answer to my next question, because indeed, wondering, we're here, we have our Marxist groups and all, our progressives and our leftists. We sometimes can wonder from, like, what should we be doing about these events? How can we act upon them? And you, of course, explained already a bit with the actions and all, but do you think there's more that we can be doing?
I mean, one of the key problems we face is the problem of communication. The large media, the big money media, is not interested any longer in debating and disputing us. They are not interested. They have shut out the left from discussion and debate. It was a long time ago that the mainstream television stations would have invited a leftist to have a debate or discussion. It's been a long time. That doesn't happen. We on the left have been set aside, and we have therefore an enormous communication challenge. How to communicate our views to large and larger numbers of people, given that the money media has closed us down. You build your own media, but our audiences are not what we would like them to be. So in that sense, what I always say is that everybody who watches something, like if somebody watches this, send it to 10, 15, 20 people. Tell them about the Welter Morgan. Tell them about other channels that you watch and so on. I mean, our small number of viewers and listeners must become our media. They are the transmission points to another 50 people, and they need to encourage the 50 people to reach more people and so on. We have to build our own channels. We don't have money. We have enthusiasm on our side. Our people are enthusiastic. We are enthusiastic people. We do things without money. I'm on here with you to chat. There's no money exchanged here. We are friends. We are comrades. We are talking. We are here enthusiastically. We don't have the money power that they have. We have something else. We have enthusiasm. We have sincerity. We want people who listen to go and tell other people. No point you reading De Welter Morgan in the privacy of your home, feeling educated and thinking the whole world is going to hell. We need you to then go and take what you've read and send it to people. You don't have to become an annoying proselytizer. This is not the, whatever it is, Jehovah's Witness. This is with sincerity. We are asking people, look, you might want to take a look at this. It's interesting. Or, look, don't look at this thing. It's boring. This guy Prashad droning away. But look at this other thing that I accidentally was able to find. That's what we require. We are having a big communication problem. We cannot reach large numbers of people. Even in our own movements, people are reading the money media. They are not reading our media. That's because of habits ingrained over long periods of time. It's very hard to break that.
Hey, you guys heard it here from Vijay Prashad himself. Share this video afterwards because I'm pretty sure we're going to have a link to share. So don't forget to do that. So you also often talk about the importance of the battle of ideas. Could you explain that? Say what you mean about that?
Yeah, it's in fact, it's a term from Marx and Engels, from the German ideology, which has been used for years in trade unions and other movements. But in the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, Fidel Castro made it a real big part of the Cuban special period. He talked about a campaign called the Battle of Ideas. And it's actually a very simple concept. It's just this. You see, as an example, in mainstream economics says that the way you have a utility calculation is you have a demand and supply curve. And, what happens is you need an optimal point, the meeting point. That's the price. That's where you price the thing. Now, the entire concept of the demand and supply curve is based not on economic science, but it's based on in a kind of behavioral psychology. In other words, it's premised on the idea of greed. I want the most for my interaction. It's called the maximizer problem. I want to maximize my return. If I'm going to sell you a box of cigarettes, I want the best price for it, and you want to get it at the lowest price, because we are both motivated by greed. So the basis of neoclassical economics is a very simple theory about human nature. And human nature is reduced. All our feelings of love and fellowship and confusion and lack of knowledge, ignorance, everything disappears, and we are brought down from this great complexity of human feeling to the issue of greed. So the whole science of modern economics is premised on greed. Now, what Castro's battle of ideas was, go to the heart of it. Argue with the curve. Say, listen, wait a minute. Is it really true? For instance, I'm a parent. I have, daughters. My daughter comes to me and says, she's in her 20s. She comes to me and says, hey, listen, I need a little extra money because this month I'm having a hard time making my rent. And I say to her, how much do you need? She says, could you give me 100 euros? I'm going to give her 150 euros. Do you know why? Because I love her and she's my daughter. And I'm not going to say, here's 100 euros, pay me back 8% interest and so on. I'm going to give her the 150 and say, my daughter, this is yours. And that 50 euros, take your partner out to dinner. Relax. You're tense right now. Because we are also motivated by love. When a mother says to a child, look, why don't you eat the last helping? I'm not hungry, right now. She is sacrificing for her child. She's motivated by love. Sometimes I go into an economic transaction. I'm going to buy a car from you. Your car is 10 years old. You say to me, I'll sell it to you for 2,000 euro. I say 2,000 euro, that's a lot of money. But I say to you, can you sell it for 1,800, please? You say, no, 1,900. I buy the car from you, 1,900 euros. Then I discover the bloody car is worth only 800 euros. You've taken me for a ride. Why? Because I was motivated by ignorance, not by greed. I just didn't know. So the battle of ideas means come to the heart of things. What is human society built on? Are we really built on greed? Is that really what motivates us? Is it just the invisible hand of Adam Smith? What about the invisible heart? When so many interactions are done out of love and care and fellowship. In fact, I would agree that the largest part of the international economy is built on love and not on greed. For instance, so much care work goes into maintaining the economy, and that's deeply patriarchal. So many women are cleaning up after men, making men their sandwiches for lunch and so on. Unpaid care work is motivated by love. So how can an economics professor tell me, let's be realistic? Realistic? Seriously? You are being unrealistic because you are saying the world is motivated by greed. It's not. I'm not saying it's not motivated by greed. I'm merely saying it's motivated by a complex bunch of emotions. And your little graph in economics number 1 on the demand and supply is not capturing the actual working of the economy. That argument is, in essence, the battle of ideas.
Okay, I thought it was pretty clear. And talking about emotions, and we have a lot of them always, especially currently in our lives, with all the wars and everything going on. A very interesting greed and love. Let's talk about China and it playing its role in the BRICS, actually. Would you also call that greed? Would you call that love? Or what would you call that? How do you see actually China within BRICS?
China is a really interesting place. People who haven't traveled to Asia don't really understand these phenomena of India, China, Indonesia, and so on. China has an almost unbroken 2,000 plus year history. They have concepts that have come to them that are not colonized. They have their own conceptual frameworks and so on. When a Chinese person says, let's plan something, they may be talking about 50 years, not the next 15 minutes. Their planning is much greater. Stability is important in the Chinese kind of political worldview and so on. Okay, people say, hey, listen, the Communist Party in China is authoritarian. I say, wait a minute. What you don't understand is that there are elements of Asian culture, including Chinese culture, which are deeply authoritarian. In South Korea, in Japan, in India, there is an authoritarianism in our cultural worlds, which we have to acknowledge. Why is that? Partly it's because, we didn't fully experience certain kinds of upheavals that we should have. China had a revolution, but the revolution took place in 1949, not in 1789. It's a very recent revolution. It's going to take a long time for Asia to develop its own grammar of democracy. It's going to take a long time. And so you see struggles within a project like the Chinese project. For some years, it's going to zig in this direction of going for a kind of stability and enforcing a certain kind of hierarchy and so on. Then it zags to the Cultural Revolution. Let's get rid of all hierarchies. very immature attempt to get rid of hierarchies, as if you can get rid of them like this. It takes a long time. Then you zag back to Deng Xiaoping, let's stabilize, let's let the rich get rich and so on. And then it zigs back to Xi Jinping. Now, Xi Jinping, having learned from the Cultural Revolution experience, is trying to attack hierarchies in China in a much more measured, slow, maybe even bureaucratic way. The way they handled the eradication of absolute poverty is incredible. It was a mass campaign, but it wasn't done with the kind of upheaval like the Cultural Revolution. They're very sensitive that they don't want to repeat that. So China, it's a complexity. It's 1.5 billion people. People ask me questions about India. Tell me about the election in India. My God, it's 1.5 billion people in India also. 642 million people voted in this election. By the way, the largest election in the world of women, 340 million women voted in this election. It's the largest single election for women voting, 340 million women. So how can you, in a very quick way, encapsulate that? India also, old civilization, colonized brutally, brutalized, wealth stolen, struggling to emerge into its own voice. Right now, the right wing in power, but the right wing constrained in this election. So yeah, we talk about China, we talk about India, but we're also talking about very old civilizations that have been in existence for much longer even than any European, coherent European project. It's not been, European coherence can be dated to perhaps the end of World War II, okay? I mean, what came before that was a whole bunch of different principalities and the squabbles and battles and so on. Europe is a very young project. In that sense, the United States even younger. And it's interesting how these young projects can be so impatient with the rest of the world. Why are you like this? Why can't you be like me? I mean, the Chinese are not turning to the West and saying, why can't you be like us? They are merely saying, let us have our own path. You do your thing, we're doing ours. And I find, although I don't entirely subscribe to the relativism, you do your thing, we'll do ours, there's some merit to that there needs to be some respect for the different historical trajectories of different parts of the world.
Now, that's, I definitely agree with that. I do think that we sometimes forget, or at least the Western countries sometimes forget, indeed, that there are those that have a bit more experience than we do in life, in history, and trying to keep something going. Well, we still have another 10 minutes, and I would like to actually kind of go towards the end. And I have a question regarding the book you had, Dark Nations. You talk about actually the Global South having tried to build a new international economic order. And that was then not really a big success. Seeing that we have nowadays China that is bringing some sort of support for places like Africa, do you think there's a bigger chance actually for that to happen nowadays or not?
It's interesting because in the 1940s and 50s, the new third world countries, led by India, Egypt, China, and Algeria, and so on, they were convinced that they could create new rules for the international order. I mean, what inspired them in a way was that they were able to build cartels. Like OPEC was the most successful third world cartel, but they were going to build cartels for aluminum, cartel for everything, for rice. Cartel for rice was in fact built, not very successful. But there were going to be all these cartels, and they felt that using the power of commodity producing cartels, they could force the changing of the international trade rules. Okay, that was their feeling. Now, they couldn't do it. It didn't succeed because they were trying to politically force the rules to change. We are in a completely different moment where what's happening is the structures of world trade are changing. Nobody's trying to politically enforce a change. In fact, I'm going to come to that in a minute. The structures are changing. In other words, look, when the West went for globalization in the 1990s, they transferred a huge amount of industrial production to the third world countries, because they say we'll take advantage of cheap labor, we'll take advantage of better transportation, better communication through satellites, container ships, and so on. Okay, but having transferred industry to the third world, those countries then started to reverse engineer some of the technologies and became industrial powerhouses. China in the lead, it's an industrial powerhouse. And then they started to build their own trading networks. It's very hard to stop them. There's some sovereignty in capitalism. If I'm a big company and I want to start making phones, my name is Huawei, and I start selling phones for a tenth the price of Apple, and I sell them in Africa, Asia, I've become a big conglomerate. So now I'll say to Apple, compete with me. Let's compete. Apple, here's a Huawei phone, here's an Apple phone. My phone is 1/10 the price. My camera is better than yours. I'm equally good. Let's compete. You can't compete with me. So then the West comes in as these new structures are being built, these new trading networks, these new supply lines, and so on. The West comes in, and as they said in the latest G7 communique, at the G7 meeting, the world starts to change, they said, no, wait a minute. We need a rules-based trading order. That's the phrase from the G7 communique. And they accuse, say, Chinese companies of being, manipulators or of stealing your data. I mean, the accusation that a Chinese company is going to steal your data, which they haven't yet done or not been proved yet, is astounding, because Edward Snowden already showed that Western phone companies are already mining your data. And in fact, they're tapping Angela Merkel's phone and God knows who else's telephone, the phones of the judges at the International Criminal Court being tapped by the Israelis. So instead of being able to commercially deal with the arrival of these other countries, you start to criminalize their trading activity and say they are not following the rules-based trading order. So what's happening now is, if in the 1970s, the third world wanted to politically change the trading system, now it's the first world that wants to impose by politics their hegemony over the trading system, which they are losing control over. So Europe, for instance, can't get cheaper 5 and 6G technology from Huawei, because you are now scared that that's a conduit to the Chinese government, which is ridiculous. But you're willing to buy tools from the United States government, which has already been doing surveillance of you. So this is an interesting, we are at a moment now where the call for a new international economic order is not going to come from the South, because the South doesn't need to call for it. It's already happening. They are already building the structures. The new development bank in Brazil is already creating a new way to finance development. You don't need to go to the UN to call politically for the new international economic order. It's already happening. It's the West now that's calling for a rules-based trading order because their order is disappearing.
That is a really interesting thing, I think, to see. That comes back to the first topic we're having, right? The tilting of the North and South, and you see the South standing up a lot for yourself with that. Well, we only have still, indeed, a few minutes to go. Is there anything very small you'd like to share with us still, Vijay?
Well, I just want to say that I'm really very excited to come to Manifiesta in Belgium this year, partly because I'm very excited to talk about several things. One of them being the issue of Palestine. I'm excited in a negative way to talk about that because it's a very pressing issue. But I'm also very excited to continue the conversation about Peter Merton's book Mutiny, which I think is a terrific account of the world tilting. And Peter has himself, by titling the book Mutiny, has raised for us this issue of the million mutinies around the planet, that are at a small scale. A Belgian worker who says, I'm not going to load weapons onto a ship to go to Israel. That's a small mutiny with big ramifications. And then a big mutiny, 100,000 farmers go on strike and so on. So I'm very excited that, and I'm also very, very happy that we're going to have an event at Manifiesta to talk about a new book on the arms trade, which is being edited by Paul Rogers and Andrew Feinstein. Andrew Feinstein is running for the British Parliament, contesting the seat of Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party. And that book has got a foreword by Jeremy Corbyn, who will also be there at Manifiesta with Andrew Feinstein to release the book on the arms trade, because the global arms trade is one of the great suffocators of humanity. It's like a boa constrictor, which has just got its, its open mouth and is sucking humanity into its body. No offense to boa constrictors or lovers of boa constrictors. I didn't mean to use an analogy, because arms dealers are worse than boa constrictors. In fact, we should say that a boa constrictor is sometimes referred to like an arms dealer, not to embarrass them. But I'm very pleased to come to Manifesto to talk about all these themes, the arms trade, warmongering, the lack of negotiations, and more than anything else, the wastage of our precious global treasure on conflict, rather than using that precious global treasure to solve issues of climate change, to solve issues of enduring patriarchy, to solve issues of racism, to solve issues of class exploitation. I mean, our global treasure is immense. Why are we wasting it on confrontation when we should be using our ingenuity to solve problems? Lula said this at the International Labour Organization meeting. Very clever statement. He said, we should be solving problems on our planet, not allowing individuals to become so wealthy that they have rockets to go to other planets. I, of course, believe some of these individuals should just go and live on another planet. They don't belong here. But Lula's point is very well made.
I'll say to this, your words, not mine. I'd like to very much thank you, Vijay, for being here with us this evening, for everything you have shared with us. I'll also like to thank the audience for having tuned in for this webinar. And now, hopefully, I see you all back at Manifiesta, 7 and 8 of September. And for the rest, I'll wish everyone a very good evening. And yeah, that's it, I think.
From me, namaste. And not because I do yoga, but because I come from India.
Should also do yoga. It's also very good for your body.
Nothing against yoga.